The Christmas Truce of 1914. When enemies stopped fighting December 1914, Europe was only a few months into what would become the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. Millions of young men had marched proudly to war that summer, believing they would be home by Christmas. Politicians promised quick victory. Newspapers described the war as glorious. Crowds cheered as soldiers boarded trains headed for the front. But by winter, those illusions were already dead. Across northern France and Belgium, the battlefield had become a frozen nightmare. Vast trench systems stretched for hundreds of miles across Europe. British, French, and German soldiers lived buried underground like animals, surrounded by mud, rats, disease, and constant fear. Between the opposing trenches lay a scarred wasteland known as No Man's Land, a deadly strip of cratered earth filled with barbed wire, frozen corpses, and shattered trees. Some trenches stood only 50 meters apart, close enough to hear the enemy cough, close enough to hear dying men screaming through the night. Every day followed the same brutal rhythm. Artillery thundered endlessly across the horizon. Snipers waited for careless movement. Machine guns cut down anyone exposed above the trench walls. Soldiers slept in freezing water, often standing ankle-deep in mud for days at a time. Many developed trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions that sometimes led to amputation. And yet, somehow, Christmas was approaching. For many soldiers, that realization felt surreal. Back home, families were decorating trees and preparing holiday dinners. Churches would soon ring with Christmas hymns. Children were waiting for gifts beneath warm candlelight. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, young men sat in darkness, clutching rifles. Many had not washed properly in weeks. Many already carried trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The contrast was unbearable. One British soldier later wrote that the trenches felt less like a battlefield and more like the end of the world. And then, something extraordinary happened. On the evening of December 24th, German soldiers began decorating parts of their trenches with candles and tiny Christmas trees. Some had received the trees from home as gifts. Others lit lanterns along the trench walls, creating glowing lines in the darkness. At first, British troops watched cautiously. Then, through the cold winter air, they heard singing. The Germans were singing Christmas carols. One of the songs drifting across No Man's Land was Stille Nacht, Silent Night. The melody was familiar. British soldiers listened quietly for a moment before some began singing their own English version in response. Soon, voices from both sides rose together into the freezing night sky. Enemies who had spent months trying to kill one another were suddenly united by the same song. The battlefield grew strangely peaceful. A British soldier named Frederick Heath later described the moment as almost unreal. He wrote that the Germans shouted Christmas greetings toward the British trenches. Some even called out in broken English, English soldier, Merry Christmas." At first, many suspected a trap. The war had already taught soldiers to distrust everything. But as the night continued, something unusual became impossible to ignore. The gunfire was stopping. No artillery, no sniper shots, no machine guns, only silence. For soldiers who had lived under non-stop violence for months, the silence itself felt shocking. Then came voices again. "Tomorrow you no shoot, we no shoot." Cautiously, soldiers on both sides peeked above the trenches. Some waved, others laughed nervously. And slowly, almost unbelievably, men began climbing out of the trenches and stepping into No Man's Land. The same territory that hours earlier meant certain death was now filling with soldiers approaching each other without weapons raised. Many later described the moment as deeply emotional. Young men who had been taught to hate each other suddenly stood face to face, realizing how similar they truly were. Most were exhausted. Most were terrified. Most simply wanted to go home. A British rifleman later recalled meeting a German soldier who showed him a photograph of his family. The British soldier responded by showing his own family picture. Neither man spoke the other's language fluently, yet somehow they understood each other perfectly. Others exchanged gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons from uniforms, bread, alcohol, small souvenirs from home. Some soldiers even cut each other's hair. One account described German troops sharing beer and sausages with British soldiers while both sides laughed together in the middle of the battlefield. For a brief moment, the war seemed to disappear, but perhaps the most haunting part of the truce involved the dead. For weeks, bodies had remained scattered across no man's land because retrieving them under enemy fire was nearly impossible. Many corpses had frozen where they fell. During the truce, soldiers from both sides worked together to bury the dead. Enemies carried bodies side by side. Some held joint funeral services. Prayers were spoken in multiple languages. One British soldier later wrote that seeing German troops helping bury British dead completely changed how he viewed the enemy. Until then, propaganda had portrayed Germans as monsters. But monsters did not quietly help bury strangers beneath the winter sky. Monsters did not sing Christmas hymns. Monsters did not exchange family photographs. For many soldiers, the truce shattered the illusion that the men across the trenches were fundamentally different from themselves. And then came the football matches. Over time, stories about football during the Christmas truce became legendary. Historians still debate exactly how many games occurred or how organized they truly were. But multiple first-hand accounts confirmed that soldiers from opposing sides kicked footballs together in no man's land. There were no proper fields, no uniforms, no referees, no cheering crowds, just exhausted young men briefly escaping the insanity surrounding them. One German veteran later remembered British and German soldiers laughing together while chasing a football through muddy ground scarred by shell craters. For a few precious hours, the battlefield no longer felt like a place built for killing. It felt human again. News of the truce quickly spread. Some newspapers back home portrayed it as a beautiful symbol of humanity surviving amid horror. Others worried it revealed something dangerous. Military commanders were especially alarmed. To generals and political leaders, the truce represented a serious threat to discipline. Modern industrial warfare depended on soldiers continuing to view the enemy as something distant and inhuman. Once troops recognized each other as ordinary people, continuing the slaughter became psychologically far more difficult. One British officer reportedly complained that the soldiers were becoming too friendly with the Germans. Orders soon arrived demanding an immediate return to combat. In some sectors, officers threatened punishment if soldiers attempted future truces. Artillery bombardments resumed. Machine guns reopened fire. The war returned. And yet, many soldiers struggled emotionally after the truce ended. A British soldier later admitted it felt almost impossible shooting at Germans again after sharing cigarettes with them only days earlier. Some soldiers intentionally fired above enemy heads during the days following the truce, unwilling to directly kill men they had just laughed beside. Military leadership noticed this hesitation quickly. As the war continued, armies took greater steps to prevent fraternization between opposing troops. Units were rotated more often, surprise attacks increased, propaganda intensified. The High Command understood a terrifying truth. If soldiers stopped hating each other, the war itself became harder to sustain, and the war was only beginning. The Christmas Truce of 1914 would never happen again on the same scale. As World War I dragged on, the violence became even more industrialized and horrifying. Poison gas entered the battlefield. Massive artillery offensives erased entire landscapes. Battles like Verdun and the Somme killed hundreds of thousands. Any remaining romantic ideas about war vanished forever. By 1918, more than 16 million people would be dead. An entire generation would be traumatized. Empires would collapse. Europe itself would be permanently transformed. Yet, despite all of that destruction, the Christmas Truce endured in memory because it revealed something extraordinary about human nature. The soldiers who participated in it were not politicians. They were not generals. They were ordinary young men trapped inside circumstances far beyond their control. Most had no personal reason to hate each other. Many shared similar backgrounds, similar fears, and similar dreams. The truce exposed the painful contrast between the people fighting wars and the systems demanding those wars continue. Even today, historians still study the Christmas Truce because it feels almost impossible. A moment of peace appearing in one of history's most brutal conflicts. A moment where humanity briefly overpowered nationalism, propaganda, and fear. And perhaps that is why the story still resonates more than a century later. Because deep down, people recognize something profoundly tragic within it. The soldiers proved peace was possible, not permanently, not politically, but humanly. For one cold Christmas in 1914, men who had every reason to kill one another instead chose compassion. They sang together, laughed together, buried the dead together, played football together. And for a single brief moment in history, the war stopped. Then the guns returned, the trenches filled once again with mud and blood. Young men resumed killing each other across the same frozen ground where they had exchanged Christmas greetings only days earlier. But the memory remained, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, humanity itself can still survive. Even in hell, people can still choose peace,